Hi students, this is Lisa Sharlock and welcome to the senior seminar for both international studies and political science. The theme of this senior seminar is terrorism, rather broadly defined. And of course the focus of it is going to be individual research, but for the first part of the course I'll be doing weekly lectures to give you a little bit of an overview of terrorism and some of the topics you might want to research. Please read through the syllabus carefully and think about what it is you would want to do for the paper assignments. Look over those carefully, please. And without further ado, I will commence the lecture. So this is going to be the first part of what will be a two-part lecture. And again, just to reiterate, please keep our class time, 1:20 to 2:15 open, because we may well end up doing this on Zoom. Okay, first of all, I'm going to talk about terrorism and definitions and understandings thereof. You may have heard the expression, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. So an example that I'm going to look at in this part of the lecture is in South Africa, the struggle against apartheid or white minority rule. Rhodesia was also white minority rule. It's Zimbabwe today, and it's southern Africa, but it was a separate country. So in hindsight, of course, unless one is a white supremacist, one probably sympathizes with the freedom fighters, right? However, at the time, they were widely considered, primarily by Westerners, to be terrorists, right? And I think it's a good example of how understandings of terrorism change across space and time. So among the heroes and sheroes that have been accused of terrorism, we have, I'm starting at the bottom here, Nelson Mandela, right? Even though I think the depiction of him today in the United States is, sort of like a saintly figure, right? He was definitely a warrior, right? Others, you can see here, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Che, Castro, Mao, Nelson Mandela, and I'm sure you can add more names to the list. Looking more locally or in more recent times, some of you have been involved in some of the political activities going on over the summer, and perhaps you have been involved in organizations that have been deemed terrorists by some of your fellow citizens. So if we were in a classroom, I would ask you to watch a couple of videos about violence in the anti-apartheid struggle and Nelson Mandela's role. The first one I think we'll skip. It was about MK Umkhonto we Sizwe in Zulu, which means Spear of the Nation, and it was the military wing of the ANC, the African National Congress, which was the primary group opposing apartheid, and it's now the ruling party in South Africa. There is, however, a short clip on Nelson Mandela, freedom fighter or terrorist, which I've posted to the module page for this lecture, and if you would kindly pause this video and take a look at the discussion, at the video about him being freedom fighter or terrorist. Okay, welcome back. So in terms of what is terrorism, in terms of the definition of terrorism, there is no definition in international law, and many students are surprised by this. But let me repeat that for emphasis. There is no definition of terrorism in international law. Right? The UN has been trying to hash one out for a long time. It hasn't happened yet. And this is largely because terrorism is a normative term. To say something is normative means that it's value-laden, right? It's a judgmental term. And that's why To some, this Palestinian guerrilla is a freedom fighter, and to some, he's a terrorist, right? So basically, terrorism is political violence perpetrated by your enemies, right? If it's your friends doing it, then they're freedom fighters. So it's really a fuzzy term. It's basically meaningless. In political science, the definition that we tend to use for terrorism, even though there's not one in international law, is violence perpetrated by non-state actors targeting civilians and intended to cause fear. Right, so non-state actors, we preclude the possibility of governments being terrorists, right? So it's got to be not governments. And that's because we define the state as the territorially based institution with the exclusive legitimate right to the use of force. Right, that's based on Max Weber's definition. So any violence perpetrated by the state, according to us, is just A-OK. Right? Targeting civilians, because targeting military is considered an act of war, right? So, basically military is fair game in war. Targeting civilians, no, that's terrorism. And intended to cause fear. And so that's where the term terror comes from, right? The idea is to cower a population by attacking a few of them and thus keeping everybody else shaking in their proverbial boots. Often they emphasize the random nature of terrorism, right? So, if we think of sort of classical stabbing people at random on the streets of London or whatever, it's not an assassination, right? The perpetrators of terrorism are not necessarily going after particular individuals, right? They want to just kill somebody, anybody, and make the entire civilian population feel like they might be next. And I don't know what it is you're supposed to see suspicious here, but whatever. Now, can states perpetrate terrorism? Well, according to the definition that I gave you, no. Right? Obviously, there are many, even within political science, who think that states can and in fact do perpetrate terrorism. So one example might be some of the violent land grabs that go on around the world, particularly against indigenous peoples. And here we have one such in West Bengal, India. Right? And in these cases, agents of the state, soldiers, paramilitaries, etc., police in some cases are forcing the people off of their land, which they are going to appropriate for development. In South Africa, again, during the years of apartheid or strict racial segregation, in the 1980s, Dr. Wouter Basson, although he was actually not a doctor at that point, was hired by the South African government to come up with a campaign of biological warfare through what was known as Project Coast. And if you want some really creepy reading, Google it. No, you can find reputable sources, not Wikipedia, but he had his little helpers put cholera in the wells in the surrounding areas. The idea being to poison the quote-unquote freedom fighters in exile there, but they had kids and anybody else. Fortunately, he was not a doctor, and he obviously didn't realize that was not going to be an effective way to transmit cholera. But he did things like poison soda cans, and he asked his assistants, let's see if this works, go out to the taxi stand, hand these out to the taxi drivers, and let's see if it kills them. Right? All sorts of other creepy tactics, which I think that we could probably equate with terrorism. States often, especially today, indirectly are involved in terrorism, right? And states like to use paramilitaries, party activists, death squads, gangs, etc. to do their dirty work. That's because if the killers get caught, then the state can wipe its hands clean and say, oh, but we didn't know about it, right? So an example of this might be the taking of 52 U.S. citizens hostage in Iran during the revolution of 1979. Right, so purportedly it was the Iranian students who did that. Going back to South Africa, the IFP, Inkatha Freedom Party, was an ethnic Zulu political party that the white government basically trained and used to divide and conquer, right? They encouraged ethnic warfare among the black Africans so that they would not be fighting their common enemy, which was white supremacy, right? So the IFP militias were trained and supplied by the white oligarchy, right? So they were definitely the equivalent of a paramilitary force fighting the ANC. More contemporary example here, the Saudi prince is said to have a death squad known as the Tigers, right? So this chart is about the attempted extrajudicial killing, and we know, of course, that they've been successful in others. And most recently, Moscow, of course, also has a military intelligence agency, the GRU, that's known for basically being a death squad. And this image does not have the most recent attack on Navalny in Siberia, although it looks like they're just showing the ones outside of Russia anyway. But again, if the people who poisoned, say, Navalny are caught, most likely the Russian government will say, you know, they're rogue actors, we didn't know anything about it. So can you think of other examples of state-sponsored terrorism involving paramilitaries, militia, etc.? I've included 2 here, but I'm sure you can come up with some others. All right, so this chart, or the first chart, you might want to stop the video so that you can read through it carefully. This is a list of different types of terrorism, right? And it's not the definitive list, right? Some people would probably quibble with some of these definitions, right? But it gives you an idea of some of the different subcategories that we will be looking at. And maybe some of these will be of particular interest to you when you try to decide what it is you want to write your papers on. Okay, so if we were in person, I would ask you to explain some of the reasons why no universal definition of terrorism currently exists, and whether you think that there can be or will be agreement on a definition anytime soon. All right, so real-world consequences. What are real-world consequences of the fact that there is not a universal definition of terrorism? What are consequences for this lack at the international level and at the domestic level, right? And so some of these might be questions you want to hash out on the discussion board for this week. To get full credit, you're going to have to reference the readings in some way, shape, or form, but you can certainly pull up some of these themes in the readings. Okay, second part of this lecture, and the third part will be a separate PowerPoint presentation. Some of the misconceptions about terror, right? So one of the common misconceptions, all Muslims are terrorists, all terrorists are Muslim, blah, blah, blah. I don't even want to go there. I'm hoping that none of you have those sentiments or prejudices, right? But of course, these beliefs are quite prevalent among many of our fellow citizens, and also in Europe as well, right? As are stereotypes about skin color and terrorism. So the first assumption, because I'm just dismissing the, all people who look like X are terrorists. First assumption that I'm going to poke holes in is that the lack of a state is a breeding ground for terrorism. Right? And so that's what's often said about Somalia, that not having a government for 30 years made it a terrorist hotspot. And Mogadishu did, in fact, become a terrorist hotspot, right? But other parts of Somalia, basically did their own thing and weren't necessarily. So I don't think you can say that that not having a state necessarily breeds terrorism. And of course, if we look at terrorism in the world, we find that state-perpetrated terrorism can be especially lethal, right? So the idea that, oh, you need a state or otherwise you'll have terrorism, well, actually, I think it's more likely you're going to have terrorism if you have a state, right? The state usually has more access to money and arms than do traditional terrorist groups. So here are some of the bloody state leaders, Assad in Syria, Omar al-Bashir, formerly president of Sudan, etc., who have perpetrated what many would call terror. Okay, the second assumption that I'm going to debunk is that poverty causes terrorism. Right? So it's one of those things everybody says, but if you think about it, why would poverty cause terrorism? Right? Maybe that you think you don't have as much to lose, but the poverty-terrorism nexus is not supported by evidence. And, in fact, we find that terrorists tend to come from relatively affluent families, right? There are exceptions, but they tend to come from privilege. Right? Maybe they have more leisure time to engage in terrorism. And most of you are probably too young to remember the underwear bomber, but he was the son of a Nigerian banker who tried to blow up a passenger plane to the United States on Christmas. Excuse me. Okay, third assumption is that the West is worst affected by terrorism, right? That we're under siege by terrorists. And what we find is actually most terrorism does not happen in the West. 95% of deaths from terrorism take place in MENA, the Middle East or North Africa, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. And so the source for this data is the data that I just gave you is from UNESCO, United Nations agency. So that's 95% of the deaths and 84% of the attacks are taking place in these three regions, which are not the West. Okay, fourth assumption is that it's refugees and recent migrants who are bringing terrorism to the West, right? So think about the outrage a couple years back at swarms of Syrian refugees and the purported terrorists who were among them, right? In fact, most terrorist attacks are perpetrated by people born in the country that they target. So one example here, of course, would be the Pulse Club shooter Omar Mateen, who, although of Afghan heritage, was born in New York. All right, fifth assumption is that terrorism is something new, right? And here we have a couple of books with the age of terrorism in the title, right? And about airplane travel, right? So we're assuming that it's something that post-dates the development of passenger planes. And surprise, surprise, it's not. There were actually more terrorist deaths in Western Europe in the late 20th century than there have been in the post-September 11th era, the 21st century. So the question I have here, do any real distinctions exist between old and new forms of terrorism? Discuss with examples. Right. Again, this is a question that you might want to hash out in the discussion board, although you must be grounded in the week's reading to get credit. And these pictures relate to the 1919 anarchist bombings in the United States. Okay, and the next, I got ahead of myself here, so we'll end this PowerPoint presentation with that slide.